Welcome to the Why God Why podcast. My name is Peter Englert. We exist to respond to the questions you don't feel comfortable asking in church. I'm also so thankful for Nathan Yoder, our fantastic producer. And today we are bringing on Ben Sturdeke. He'll share a little bit more about himself, but he's from Gravity Leadership, which also includes the Gravity podcast. And we interviewed one of the co-authors of a recent new book, Having the Mind of Christ, 8 Axioms of a Robust Faith. I can tell you that book has made a huge difference in my life, and I'm looking forward to asking him this question today, which is this: why are Christians so focused on doing if they believe in grace? And Ben, I'm going to try to answer this, but we're really hoping that you can bring a ton of insight. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's something I've thought about a lot. So I'm hopeful too that we can have a good conversation and bring some clarity for people.
Awesome. Well, hey, before we jump in too much, just give us a little update. The last episode we had you on was about grief. We were kind of in the middle of the pandemic. Just update our listeners about your life.
Yeah. So still a pandemic. Sort of feels like the after effects of the pandemic. We don't think about it, right, as much as we used to. But obviously COVID is still with us, and I think there are still after effects taking place. So, but as far as my life goes, not a whole lot has changed. I'm still working part-time with Gravity Leadership and also part-time with our church plant here in, we planted maybe 7 years ago. I'm not sure if we're allowed to call ourselves a plant anymore, but yeah, still working with the church, here in Indianapolis. And so not too much has changed, but we're trying to sort out what the post-pandemic ministry looks like. We've noticed some subtle shifts in terms of how people respond to what we do at Gravity, but also some shifts in how people respond at church to different things that come up. So these are interesting days for me. So anyway.
Well, before we just a quick question about that. Do you ever feel like either you have two hats on as a pastor and kind of a coach consultant, or do you ever feel like you can take one of them off and focus? Or, how do you, is there boundaries, or is it kind of meld together like spaghetti?
Yeah, that is a good question. I've been thinking about this a lot lately for some reason. But yeah, there's benefits and drawbacks to it. A lot of time, because I think the nature of the work is similar. So, we use a lot of the same kind of discipleship tools in our local church as we train people with, at Gravity. So there's some overlap there. It's similar work, working with leaders through Gravity, but also just working with people in discipleship church environments. So there's some overlap there. There are weeks though where I wish I could focus on one or the other, because I do feel pulled in two different directions a lot of times. So yeah, I don't know. Some days I like it, other days I don't. Just to be honest, you know what I mean? So it's okay. But yeah.
Well, I'm sure
we're doing now.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it affords us, the thing I like about being bivocational is there is a lot of variety in terms of my day and what I get up to in any given week. And also it affords us the ability to co-pastor our church. And so I really like that as well, being able to have some co-pastors and not feel like everything lands on my shoulders. I've done that kind of pastoral work before too. And that can be difficult.
So there is a little method to my madness in the sense of, you're someone that's really thoughtful. And the question that we have today, I think, is what so many people struggle with, is this idea that Christianity talks about doing and grace. And I think it's good for our listeners to even hear that you kind of wrestle with feeling like there's a ton to do. And, to kind of get us started, one of the most powerful axioms from the book and that you wrote about having the mind of Christ is God is love, so God is all about love. And even people that don't go to church and might even be against Christianity, they could fill in that blank. But it just seems that wherever we are, whether we're doubting, deconstructing, consistent followers of Jesus, or faithful, wherever we are kind of spiritually in our journey, this seems like one of the hardest things to experience. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. So, say more about your question. What's one of the hardest things to experience?
That God is love and he's all about love.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons for that. I think, one is that, and we talk about this in that chapter on that axiom in the book. One is that I think we have sort of covered over some of when you look at them all together, all the claims of the New Testament about what God is all about, and who God is, and therefore what life is all about, that it's all about love. I think we've kind of papered over some of those claims and made Christianity into something other than what the New Testament claims that it is. So I think that's one reason that we have difficulty. We don't have a robust enough understanding of what love is, what real, love. And the New Testament tells us this is how we know what love is, and we look at Jesus and we look at that, especially the cross, and then we can understand. Okay, now we know what love is, and we can kind of go from there in a sense of kind of discovering what that might mean for us. So I think that's one reason. I think another reason is that the way that we experience God as love can't be very easily divorced from the way that we experience the church and other people. That I think it's actually part of how we are meant to encounter God is through the material world, through creation. And that includes, theologically speaking, that, the Eucharist, I come from a liturgical tradition, so that's very important. But, these embodied elements of bread and wine, we actually encounter God through them. And I think that we're also meant to encounter God through the church, through our relationships with people, with the body of Christ. And I think, the fact that none of us are perfect embodiments of the love of God for each other, I think is another reason that we find it difficult to experience this, that God is love. And so it's all about love. I think we sometimes think about our relationship with God kind of in, disembodied terms. We think of it as like, okay, this is something I'm going to do during my prayer time, and I'm going to experience God as love. Maybe we think it's going to happen to me through feeling a certain feeling when I pray, or feeling a certain feeling when I go to church. And it's a lot bigger than that, and it's a lot more than that. And I think it's a lot riskier than that, because we do have to entrust ourselves to people to be able to encounter and cultivate the kind of loving relationships that I think are meant to be icons of the way that God loves us. Not perfectly, but I think we need that embodied aspect of love to really understand what it is.
I want to come back to the people part, because I think there's, kind of just in your work, not just the book, that comes up a ton. But, you got me thinking as you were talking that I met a pastor yesterday, and he said one of the questions that he likes to ask people is, when you imagine the face of God, what emotion does God have when you see God? And, I've just been thinking about that a lot. And even just for my own life, I think one of the hazards of growing up Christian is, you subtly see a God that wants more from you or is disappointed with you. But I guess, is there a question like that you ask people to kind of gauge where they're at? Or even how would you answer that question where you are right now? What emotion do you see on God's face, when you pray? Or, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we come at this. I think it's a great question because a lot of us have been taught to. I don't. When we think about who God is, we immediately retreat into our minds and the sort of the theological tenets that we know. And so, if we know that God is love, then we say, "Well, I believe that God is love." There's a sense in which that's true, but it does take a little diving under the surface, doesn't it, to understand how we actually feel about God. And so, one of the frameworks that's been really helpful for me, we mentioned this in the book. I think it's in Axiom 2, where we talk about God is just like Jesus, or is that Axiom 3? I think that's Axiom 3. Um, we talk about what is God like? You know, if God is love and it's all about love, okay, great. And then if God is always present at work, great. But what's this God like who, is always present at work? And we look to Jesus to discover that. And so one of the frameworks that we've used to kind of get people out of their heads and into their hearts as it relates to like, how do I feel about God, is our friend Crispin Mayfield wrote a book called Attached to God. And we use a lot of his framework in that chapter, where he talks about using attachment theory, which is a psychological framework, but you use attachment theory to think about this is how we imagine ourselves relating to God. That it's more than just the facts that we believe about God. Perhaps it does relate to the heart. It relates to, and these are things that we pick up. These are things that we don't intend to pick up, but oftentimes do. And so, if God is a father, then we're sort of going to automatically impute aspects of our own father, right? Or our own parents. We're going to impute that onto God without really knowing that we are. And it causes us to feel attached or not to God in a certain way. And so we found that attachment theory language to be really helpful. And he describes quite well, things like anxious attachment. And so, we've kind of used some of those categories to help people, discover how do I feel attached to God or not. And I think that's been a really helpful framework for us. And it gets into, so for example, there's a way of relating to God. I think this one's called anxious attachment, where we feel 100% responsible for the relationship. And we've got phrases for this, right? Like if you feel far away from God, it wasn't God who moved, right? And I think that's meant to be perhaps encouraging, like, oh, God didn't go anywhere. But actually, I think what it does is it loads us up with guilt. Be like, oh, I did. Apparently, so if I don't feel close to God, it's 100% my fault, and my relationship with God is 100% my responsibility. And so if I don't pray enough, or if I don't go to church enough, or if I don't do the right things for God or with God, that God will eventually become distanced from me, and that'll be nothing but my fault. But I think it ends up painting a picture for us, right, of a God who doesn't actually care about us, who's indifferent towards us, a God who is like, well, you can be in relationship with me if you want, or if you don't want to, that's fine with me too. It's up to you. And so that kind of anxious attachment is a lot of us have, and so we feel guilty and anxious if we don't pray for a week, or if we fail to do our quiet time, or if our quiet time doesn't yield the emotional results that it used to. Like, we've got this anxiety about our relationship with God, where we can't just rest. Like in a healthy human relationship, like we would know in a human relationship that's anxious and unhealthy, right? For me to constantly be worried about whether or not my wife and I are connecting on a deep level. Like, are we okay? Did I do something wrong? Is there something that I should be doing? Should we go out on more dates? Should we do different things on our dates? Like, how can I make sure that our relationship is okay? It's actually healthy for me and my wife to be able to just relax, just, we're okay. It's fine. Just relax. You can, read a book in the same room, and you don't need to be constantly be anxious about it. So that's a helpful framework, I think, for me. Thinking about attachment theory.
I think you said a lot there that connects with our listeners, because I think one of the things I'm hearing you say is, and it even goes back to that cliche that comes from a good place, but it's not helpful, that we moved, maybe God didn't, is that when we when we want to grow spiritually, or when we feel distant to God, the majority of Christians who mean really well will tell us to do something. It's like, oh, you feel far from God, sit in silence and solitude. Oh, you don't feel like God loves you. You need to go to church more. And I guess, what's the alternative to that? Like, if I'm sitting down with my friend, or even if I'm kind of, I wouldn't say self-regulating, if I'm trying to self-reflect, maybe God has a different way, maybe not. I don't know. What would be the alternative to maybe doing that? Maybe it's an American thing or something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is something about our technological mindset where we sort of look at most things as problems to be solved, and so we think about our relationship with God in the same way. If it's going well, it means I sort of feel good about it. And if I feel bad about it, or I feel distant from God, which are these are very normal experiences for everybody, we immediately think that it's a problem that I need to solve. And so if I'm trying to help you with that, it's easy, like you said, to go into problem solving mode, which is to give advice, to recommend, have you tried this spiritual discipline? Have you tried this spiritual discipline? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? And the problem with that is that it keeps the whole conversation within the realm of, if you feel distant from God, number one, it's a problem. And number two, it's a problem to be solved. And actually, I would want to question those assumptions, both of those assumptions. If you feel distant from God, maybe it's not necessarily a problem, right? And maybe there's nothing really to be done about it, actually. And so I would want to ask deeper questions about the paradigm that the person is living in, right? And this is our book. It's about sort of moving from just practices and sort of, treating every spiritual problem as if it's, something to be solved through practices, and start to think about, well, what does this mean about how I think about God? What does this mean about how I think about my relationship with God? So if somebody did say to me, I feel far away from God, people actually, I can think of 3 people in my church right now that are dealing with various forms of this, right? And so we do have conversations about it. The question I would want to ask is to say, oh, well, tell me about that. Like, what's the difference for you? How do you know you feel far away from God, or how do you know you're far away from God? Not as a way of challenging, them and saying, you're wrong, but to say, let's explore that together. What does that feel like? What's going on for you that makes you feel far away from God? And then we can move into a realm where maybe we can uncover where there might be a lie at work. Because, perhaps it's actually growth for someone to feel far away from God, because they used to have maybe it was a fairly immature relationship with God, where it was all regulated or what am I trying to say? Mediated through my emotions. So, I feel close to God because, man, we kick into that chorus, or the modulation comes, and I feel really close to God because I have warm fuzzies when the worship music plays, but I don't have warm fuzzies anymore when the worship music plays. Well, like, we would totally, if we just said, like, well, maybe you can go to a different church, or maybe you need to play a different kind of worship music, or maybe you should try some silent, like, if we treat it as a problem to be solved, I think we miss out on the fact that maybe God's drawing me deeper into a different kind of relationship that isn't necessarily mediated through the emotions I feel when worship music is played. Maybe God is calling me into a more secure attachment where I can just rest. I don't need the constant affirmation of good emotions to feel close to God. I can just rest in God's presence with me, whether I feel it or not. So that's just an example. I think the alternative for me then is, instead of jumping to advice, I would want to ask questions about what that experience means, and then maybe raise questions about what it means and does it mean, and be able to proclaim, and this is a big part of our practice as well, to be able to proclaim good news to someone. So what the person who feels far away from God needs is not advice about how to get close to God. What they need is good news about who God is. That's what they need.
There's a lot of directions I could go. This is super helpful, but I kind of want to hone in. What's your definition of grace, or how do you understand it? Because I think that probably is going to clarify this question too.
Yeah, for sure. I thought of that when you told me about the topic. That I think a lot of Christians have a definition. And I don't know if this is a definition, but it is a description of grace. We'll say that. A lot of Christians have a picture of grace as if it's sort of just leniency. It's God pulling his punches. It's God sort of saying, like, you know what? You deserve this, but I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to be lenient. I'm going to let some things go. It's God winking at us and, letting things slide. But I don't think that's big enough as a vision of grace. I think grace it has to do with God's presence. So grace is God's presence being given to us as a gift. So grace has to do with gift, and I think it has to do with, it's not a and the gift that grace has to do with the person that God is. It's not a commodity that God gives us. It's not a get out of jail free card that can be experienced apart from the gift giver. Does that make sense? So if I give you a gift, Peter, for Christmas, and you don't like it and you re-gift it, you know what I mean? Like that gift going to someone else, they're going to associate that gift with you, not with me. Right? Because they don't know me. They don't know who I am. But God's gifts are not like that. They're not commodities that are passed around. They're not like products that we can use. All of God's gifts have to do with God's presence. They have to do with the gift giver himself. And so grace then for me is God giving himself to us, his presence to us.
So before this last question, I actually wanted to go in this direction. And I think it actually works really well. We'll find out. You can let me know. So I had a professor in college that talked about different seasons, and because we were talking about God feeling distant, and two of the seasons were God is distant, life is really hard, and the other season is God is distant, but life is really good. The life is hard, God is distant. We can come back to that maybe, but I'd actually like to focus a little bit more based on your definition of grace, that life is good, but God feels distant. So you painted this picture of grace, of leniency. So I could look at a really good season, I've got a 4-year-old, I've got a 20-month-old, and we're sleeping through the night. Things are going well, and just there's a beautiful rhythm in the relationship with my family. But, I don't feel, close to God in different ways just because the time is different, trying to get mornings and stuff. And I think that some people in my season would say God is distant. Man, I must have to work harder, but life is really good. Am I about to walk into a hard time? And I think even your definition of grace, which is God's presence, it's almost like maybe God's actually giving you permission to enjoy this season because it's so difficult, or something like, I don't know. Does that kind of make, I guess I'm just trying to get concrete to something like this.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that, the way that I would talk about that with somebody, if they were saying like, yeah, life is good, I'm really enjoying my life, but I'm worried that I'm worried that I'm falling away from my faith because I don't really pray much, or I can't really pray in the way that I used to. And they're kind of worried about that, right? That's that anxious attachment. I think I would probably, again, because God's presence comes to us through creation, not in spite of creation, but through creation. Actually, God created, in my theology, God created the world to be a conduit, if you will, for God to communicate God's presence to us. And so I think I would encourage that person that perhaps you're closer to God than you think, and that the enjoyment that you feel right now through your kids, through your family rhythms, maybe that is how God is present to you right now. And so why not just turn that into prayer? So every time you have a wonderful morning with your 4-year-old playing blocks or whatever you're doing, just treat it as you're enjoying God that moment. Just treat it with thanksgiving, honor it as a gift from God, like praise God, thank God for this lovely season. And then it's all communion. It's all communion. And so, that works. It's more difficult, but in the seasons of suffering, those are seasons of communion as well. Because we know that Christ suffered for us, but also suffered and suffers with us. I think because of the incarnation, we can trust that any suffering that we are undergoing is also suffering that Christ is currently undergoing because of the incarnation, because of Jesus' connection to humanity, like eternal connection now to humanity through the incarnation, that Jesus is suffering. And so that too, even seasons of suffering, can be communion as well.
When in your personal life do you feel like you lean towards grace that's leniency versus grace at God's presence? What does that look like for you?
I'm not really sure, I guess, how to answer the question. Because I really I used to feel some anxiety about doing the right things with my prayer life and, those sorts of things. I think I've just stopped worrying about, I don't know if this is an answer to your question or not, but I don't know that I think of grace as leniency anymore, because I think my vision of who God is has changed to such a degree that it's not really I don't know. I don't feel like it's a category that makes sense to me anymore. I don't know how that sounds, or if that answers your question, or maybe I don't understand your question. But
Well, I'll get personal. Maybe this isn't a recent, but as I reflect on my life, the best basketball game. I know I talk like I'm 6'5". Should have played for the Indiana Hoosiers, where you are and stuff like that. But God made me 5'6". Anyways, so the greatest basketball game I had, I was a senior. I hit 6 threes in the first half. It was just awesome. And I ended the game and I, took my shower, got out of the dressing room, and I was just like, oh man, I didn't do my devotions this morning. And even listening to you now and looking back, what would have it been like for me to do those devotions out of, wow, God, thank you for this huge experience. This was it's really spiritual. I'm being serious. When you can't miss,
oh yeah,
you
get into that flow state.
Oh yeah,
it's going in before it goes in.
Yeah, I took some bad shots, and my coach still says anyway, and it went in. But but I just kind of remember that moment where it was like, oh man, God was being really, really nice to me. I should at least thank Him. Versus, what if I went in and said, wow, thank you. I don't know. I guess that's kind of what I'm wrestling with, your definition of grace. And I can probably come up with a recent one, but that was the first thing that came into my mind. Something good happens. Man, God must have been really lenient with me, as opposed to, wow. Yeah. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it does. And I think, I think for me anyway, there's much less of a direct connection between the good things that happen in my life and God's direct. I think it ends up being problematic if I'm going to say wow, something really good happened, and we directly attribute it to God, being nice to us or being lenient with us, because then the next day something bad happens, and we have no other way of understanding what that means except to think that God is trying to teach me a lesson or being mean to me, or Like I don't know. I think it's much more helpful for me to just think about life. Jesus said, hey, in this world, you're going to have trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just troublesome. Like, we've got sin in the world. There are people with terrible motives, like out there. There are there's wickedness and evil, and there's suffering based on the brokenness of the world. And you're going to encounter it. And it's not that God is directly responsible for you encountering blessings and you encountering suffering. It's more like, hey, life is full of blessing and life is full of suffering. But take heart, for I've overcome the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me, hitting 6 threes in the first half, and I play basketball as well, and I know what you're talking about. It just feels great. I think there's a way of just rejoicing in that and saying, I mean, maybe forget to do your devotions, but it's like, well, what are my devotions for? Am I checking a box, and is God like wanting me to behave? Well, no. What are my devotions for? My devotions are just for me to cultivate an awareness of the God who is always with me. And hey, if I hit 6 threes in the first half and I'm having a great time, then I can just thank God for a body that works and just such fun that can be had, playing a sport. And I don't need to worry about checking the devotions box because I don't think God's counting those things. I think God's presence is available to us, and I want to cultivate a deeper awareness of the God who is always present and always working. And so for me, that's what devotions are about. It's just an opportunity for me to cultivate that. But hey, so is giving thanks after hitting 6 threes. Like that's cultivating my awareness as well. So.
Well, I guess if I ever come out to Indiana, we'll shoot and we'll see who gets.
Yeah, we should find a place to shoot some hoops. Where are you at again?
Rochester, New York.
Okay, yeah, a little bit of a drive, but anyway.
Hey, we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out.
So I think you bring up something that's really important, and I'm glad that you phrased it the way we base so much of grace. And tell me if I'm wrong. I just feel like I sit down with people that their definition of grace or perspective on grace is on circumstances. Do you see that, or I don't know, like whether it's pastoring or consulting, where it's like, no, I know that God's good news is bigger and better than my circumstances, but then when you start peeling back the layers, it's like, I broke up with my boyfriend or girlfriend. I lost my job. God must. And some of these are just kind of natural, like, let's at least get them out there. But subtly, I think there is this lie. I don't know. Is that one of the biggest lies you encounter, or are there other ones too?
No, it's really big. It is true that one of the most people tend to attribute God, like to God, just like good things that happen. Things that like good circumstances, maybe the quintessential sort of shallow version of this is finding a great parking spot during the, during the busiest part of the store. Like, wow, God gave me a great parking spot. But it's like, no, that's not how God works in the world. God doesn't work to like move people around so you get a great parking spot. That's not how grace works. That's not how God works in the world. And so I think it's a huge paradigm shift, and it's a big lie that a lot of people believe that God is sort of meticulously behind the scenes controlling every aspect of life for some sort of mysterious reason, and like we're always trying to figure out what God's up to, figure out what God's doing. And it's just a huge distraction. It's just a huge distraction because it's not how God works in the world, and it prevents us from paying attention to how God is actually at work in the world. And so this is why I think coming back to grace as God's presence is so helpful, is because grace as God's presence means that in every situation, in any situation, suffering or blessing, whatever it might be, I am free to open my eyes and to perceive what God is saying, what God is doing in the midst of this. That there's not, so if suffering happens to me, I don't have to be distracted by trying to figure out why God did this. I can just rest in and it's not easy, but so I don't mean to make light of it, but I don't have to, that question is a distraction. Why is this happening to me? Why is it's happening to you for the same reason it happens to everybody? It's in this world, you will have trouble. This world is full of suffering. None of us are exempt. That's the reason. Doesn't have to do with God. That's the reason. That then frees me up to perceive what God is saying to me right now, how God is suffering with me right now, how God is what the good news that God is speaking to me in the midst of my suffering is right now. I can actually hear and perceive then what God is doing rather than get distracted by this question of, why is this happening to me?
That's super helpful. Your last axiom of the book is God transforms us through embodied participation. So I'm actually going to ask you to put on your pastor hat, not your consultant hat.
Okay.
So, we're recording this, during the Advent season. This will come out in the new year. And, so I think you and I both would believe in active participation. We care about habits. We care about, taking communion and the Eucharist together. Like we feel like those practices form us. But I think what I struggle as a pastor is the way people hear and receive that is almost so judgmental and it's disconnected. So, help, there are some church leaders that listen, help our church leaders, even help our listeners, like take the habit of daily scripture reading. Like, how does this axiom of God transforms us in embodied participation, what's the vision that you would cast for that as opposed to making people feel like it's just something else to do?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I struggle with that too, just as a pastor, calling people into new actions, right? But those old lies about what God wants from us are so entrenched that I have oftentimes, I've oftentimes learned that it's not worth trying to call everybody into that at once, but rather paying attention to where different people are at, for different reasons. And so, if someone is, for example, detoxing from or deconstructing, if you want to use that word, like from a toxic vision of who God is, that God is this taskmaster, God cares about you following the rules. And the only way you've ever thought about, say, church attendance is through this lens of the harsh, judgmental God who is going to get you for that. Like if that's the only thing that you have, like, I don't think for me as a pastor, my first move with that person isn't to say, you know what, why don't you come to church more often? I think my first move is to say, like coming to church or the need to come to church, like Sunday mornings in general feel triggering to you because they remind you of this toxic vision of God. Maybe there is a season for you to just take a break. I mean, maybe that's what you need for your formation, right? And so, for that person, maybe their practice is skipping church. Maybe that's actually important for them right now. And so, does that make sense? I think like I have to pay attention to each person's story and what work has this discipline or this practice done in the past for you? And I need to be sensitive to that as I call people into it. But I think if I was going to try to cast vision for a positive vision for, some of the traditional practices of Christian faith, I think I would cast it in terms of, the opportunity for transformation rather than something that's going to get God off your back or something that's going to like please God. It's just an opportunity for transformation. And we have to have the good news of transformation like fill our imaginations before these practices are going to make sense. And this is all like Dallas Willard. This is me channeling 20 years of reading Dallas Willard. Actually more, 25 years I think I've been reading Willard. But he talks about this in a lot of different ways, but basically just says before any disciple is going to embrace any of the practices of discipleship, they have to have a vision of the goodness of God's kingdom. And if you see the vision of the goodness of God's kingdom and the kind of person that I can become and how good it could be, well, then it's easy to step into daily scripture reading. It's easy to step into those things because I have this telos, this end point in view that's like, oh, I'm participating in a process of transformation that is leading me to flourishing and to goodness. It's not just this box I got to tick to like keep a judgmental taskmaster off my back. I'm participating in goodness as I move into this. And so another quote I'm thinking about from Willard, having to do with grace, to kind of bring it back to that, is that was so helpful for me, is he said, grace is not opposed to effort.
Mm-hmm.
Grace is opposed to earning.
Mm.
And so grace and effort go together, actually. Grace and effort is the only way we grow. Grace and effort is how we're transformed. Like we do participate in this transformation. God doesn't do it automatically to us. We participate in it. And that's actually, but the only reason that we're transformed is not because of our own strength, but because of grace, because of God's empowering presence with us. But we do need to combine that with our own efforts in order to make it effective for us. So that's been a super helpful quote. Grace is not opposed to effort. It's opposed to earning. We're not earning anything, but we're participating.
I have that post quoted in my office, and I have it all over.
Yeah, it's so good, isn't it?
Yeah. And even what I'm hearing from you, because I think this is important for churches. I think this is important for our listeners to hear. You know, I use Bible reading just because I feel like that's the most concrete in the sense of, you know, so churches, you know, in January for New Year's resolutions, you know, they want to provide concrete steps. And so they'll say, hey, let's read the Bible in a year, or hey, let's go through this Bible reading plan or something like that, because there's a need for, I want to grow in this, help me how to get there. But sometimes the larger vision of when you meet with God, you're transformed, or let the word of God dwell richly in you. And so sometimes I think people leave thinking, well, I just need to read the Bible in the year and I'll be great. And it's like, well, you read a lot and you know a lot, but you're not really a person that people enjoy being around.
Yeah. Well, that brings me back to another thing that Willard said that it really transformed my ministry. I probably even talked about this last time I was on, just because I talk about it all the time. But but he talked about the as leaders, as Christian leaders, as pastors, casting vision for discipleship has to be more than just giving people the means, right? So here's a Bible reading plan. This is how you can be a disciple. It has to be about casting vision for the like the goodness of God's kingdom. Like, what is life like in God's kingdom? And so the thing that changed for me was, he was talking about the parable of the soils. The 4 different soils. So the farmer scatters his seed, and here's what happens in the various soils. And Willard's point was, he said, when you preach, just proclaim the good news of the kingdom. Like, proclaim how good it is. Like, get concrete. What kind of goodness results when we participate with God in his kingdom? What kind of people do we become? What kind of a community can we become? Like, proclaim that goodness. And he said, there'll be all kinds of people who misunderstand what you're saying, think you're saying the wrong thing, fall asleep during your sermon. Don't worry about any of that. But there'll be a few people who say, is that really true? Could that be actually true? And you can say, yeah, it's true. Well, how do I do it? And he goes, those are the people you work with. Those are the disciples. You work with those people on practices. But in the pulpit, just proclaim the goodness of the kingdom. And then that's it. That's how you do ministry. I was like, wow, that changes everything for me. So I stopped in the pulpit. I stopped trying to get people to do things. And instead, I just focused on proclaiming the goodness of the kingdom. And then when people, in our language, have a kairos, when people are like, wait a second, really? Then we just say, yeah, let's gather those people into groups, and let's grow together.
Let's do 2 more questions. I want to get really concrete, because I think some of our listeners might be wondering, how in the world can I tell if I'm actually seeing clearly the sin and the things that I'm doing wrong for healthy confession? And one of your axioms is God is always present. And I think that that's super helpful. But then how do I know when I'm going down the road of self-judgment and condemnation that isn't going to help my spiritual life to grow, how do you concretely help people delineate between those two things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because they oftentimes they're concurrent. And what I mean by that is I think I've seen in my own life and the people that I lead that a healthy conviction of sin will come, but immediately we add to it the self-condemnation. So I may have really done something wrong. So say I yell at my kids, I raise my voice, yell at them, and that's a misuse of my power as a parent. And I was harsh with them and I've sinned, and I feel bad about that. So that's like my remorse over yelling at my kids is healthy conviction of sin. But then immediately on the top of that, I feel condemned because of it, right? I condemn myself because of it. And so I think messages of self-condemnation are always going to be isolating you or trying to, they isolate you from God and from other people. And so in that scenario, maybe the message of self-condemnation is like, you're never going to get any better at this. You are a craptastic dad, and you should just stay away from your kids because you're just causing harm. You just hurt them every time you talk to them. And so, you need to get away from them. So I know now I know those kinds of messages are condemnatory messages because they're distancing me from the person that I've hurt. And I'm only seeking to distance myself from my own shame. But I think a healthy sense of conviction will lead me toward those that I've harmed, right? So a healthy sense of conviction leads me towards my kids to say, hey, I'm really sorry. I lost my temper with you. That is not fair to you. That's wrong of me to use my power in that way. And I apologize, and I hope you'll forgive me. So anyway, I think healthy conviction of sin leads to reconciliation. And so any time that we notice ourselves harshly condemning ourselves, that doesn't lead to reconciliation, because that's just me submitting to this shame, this toxic sense of shame that makes me want to hide. And so I think anything that makes you want to hide is probably not from God. Anything that leads you into reconciliation with others is probably from God.
What a great way to close this question. And so the last question is, what does Jesus have to say about, focusing on doing versus grace? He hasn't said a lot about it, so I don't know how we're going to close this.
Who knows? Yeah.
So the way this works is I'll respond to that question first, and then you can clean up whatever heretical mess I leave. So does that sound good?
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah, sure.
You were about to say, "Oh no, I won't," and you're like, "Well, wait for what he has to say."
Well, in case, yeah,
just in case.
I highly doubt we're going to hear some heresy here. So
it's all good. So just listening to you, Ben, reflecting on this question, and just, I think we read John 15 about the vine and the branches, and Jesus compares a spiritual life of us being, a branch to his vine. And, as I think about this, doing is so focused on making everything awesome and making everything quick. And grace, with God's presence, is actually focused a little bit on being boring and slow. And when I use the word boring, I guess as a pastor, I just want Christians to kind of like your life, like there's a healthy amount of boringness of the faithfulness and consistency, but the latter part about being in the vine and the branches, as I listen to you as someone that has experience, that has older kids, there's things that you're picking up on Christianity and following Jesus that only being connected to Jesus for decades will do. And I think sometimes we're so rushed in the doing that God's grace is saying it's not for us to get to where Ben is or to get to where Peter is or get to where our pastor is. It's about the grace of God has me where I am right now, and he's growing me, and it's accumulation process of these little boring things that God does in our life. So I guess that's what I'm leaving, and I hope that that's an encouragement to our listeners.
Yeah, well, it's encouraging for me, so I trust it would be. Yeah, I think I would. I love coming back to John 15. I've been thinking about that since you mentioned it, um, and I think that what I see in Jesus there, and just in my own life and the people that I get a chance to serve and lead, I think I would say something just very similar. That it's not about, like, our spiritual life is not about performing for God. It's about participation in God.
Mhm.
And so that's why I like that metaphor, Jesus' metaphor of the vine and the branches, that there is just an abiding, there's an intertwining of life, there's a mingling of life that we're called into, and that is the work. And abiding in the vine, like, we're going to bear fruit, but we're not in charge of it. There's no technology we can employ to, like, make it happen faster. It's just we're not in control.
Mm.
We're not in charge, and our only task is just to abide. To abide in the vine. And so I think it even challenges our notions, as the notions of spiritual progress that we might have. Like, I think there's ways of talking about it that can be helpful, but there's other ways of talking about it that aren't helpful, where we compare ourselves to others, or that kind of a thing. So I think that vision of abiding in the vine is helpful for me, because that's my job, that's your job, that's the baby Christian who just got to know Jesus yesterday, that's their job. And it's all part of the same thing. We're all just plugging into the vine. We're branches on the vine. And what happens in and through our lives is not ultimately up to us, but we want to just be connected. And that's the main task, and the main thing that we sort of are doing in our Christian life we're not just laying on the couch and sort of trusting that we're abiding, but we are actively participating in this life that God shares with us. And it's not about a performance for God that we're going to get a grade on. It's just about participating in the life that God shares with us. And so I think that's how those things merge together for me. Like, any doing that I'm doing, if I'm doing it in grace, I know it's going to be fruitful and effective. And so that abiding in the vine is key.
Ben, thank you so much for your generosity of your time. Where's the best place people can find you?
Yeah, so gravityleadership.com is the organization. If you want to email me, you can just email me at ben@gravityleadership.com. That's probably the easiest place to find me and what we're doing. You can get information about the book there as well. So,
one thing I'd encourage you all, this is a pro tip, Ben shares an email every Friday with a list of some great resources. So I'd encourage all of you to subscribe to that. I check it out and share it with some people.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Good. Yeah, you can find that on Gravity's site as well. Just click join our community, I think is the link. So
awesome. Well, you can find us at whygodwhypodcast.com. If you click subscribe, you'll get this episode and many others coming to your email inbox each week. Thank you so much for joining us.